Right, good evening and welcome to Beyond the Numbers. And we are 15 days to the 2024 presidential and parliamentary elections. And guess what? This year's election is going to be keenly contested. And tonight we are, discussing issues that are very important to the 18.77 million voters who are ready to cast their ballot on the 7th of December. What is that big issue? Winston Taki has that issue. What is that big issue that voters are looking at in this year's election, Winston?
The economy. One thing that I recall anytime the case of economy come about is our late president, John Evans Thomas. The comedy is, you know what I mean? But this time around, it's quite serious because Ghanaians are more considerate about how the government has been able to handle the economy since they came into power. So we'll take you through the memory lane for our viewers to understand the key happenings, our trend of inflation, our trend of employment, our trend of the youth development, and what policies that the government had intention of instituting. However, the outcome of it might or may have not necessarily ended well for citizens. But when we look at it holistically as a nation, we've seen some good indicators from the micro level.
I mean, Ghana was actually one of the few countries that went to the polls during the heat of the pandemic. And we saw how President Akufo-Addo actually dropped in terms of popularity from more than 53% in his previous 2016 elections to a little about 51% in the 2020 election. It was expected that, going into his second term, definitely some level of popularity would drop, but to drop by maybe around 2 percentage points was really huge. But after that, we've seen that the total number of registered voters has actually increased from that 17 million people, at least about 17 million people we saw in 2020.
Yes.
So this big figure we see on the screens, almost 18.8 million people who have registered to go and cast their ballots on December 7th. And we know that if you do the math, the turnout is usually between 75 and let's say even 78%. So if that number of people goes out to vote on December 7th, that is going to be huge. But the key issue that we will be discussing is the economy. And why is that important? It's important because if you look at all the surveys that have been done so far, you will see that just like the U.S. economy, it is number one or the top issues for voters going into this year's election. And definitely, you cannot talk about economy without talking about these three indicators of the economy. And that's what we're going to be testing to see if it will have any form of repercussions in this year's election, and will it influence the decision of voters coming December 7th. So take us through these three big indicators under the economy that we'll be looking at, Winston.
So when we speak about inflation, we both understand that it is the rate of change in prices, especially if the price of food product, for instance, tomatoes is 5 cedis today, and the next week is actually 8 cedis. The following week it is 10 cedis. This rate of change of price is what we get to see. Well, that does not necessarily mean the price of that commodity has come down. So when inflation drops, it means the rate of speed at which the price increases has really dropped, but not necessarily the price. Although we can see marginal abundance of that particular product in the market, which may have investors may try to spread the cost, that doesn't necessarily mean it will reduce. So it's a key issue in the mouth of Ghanaians. Recently, we interviewed on Joy FM about how people go to the market when they try to buy products. They get to understand the fact that when they send about 10,000 Ghana cedis to the market, they are not able to have the actual number of products they planned to get because of the change in price.
In simple terms, their incomes are dwindling, purchasing power of what they had is decreasing. It means that if you had 100 Ghana cedis and they could afford a certain quantity of goods, let's say a year ago or 4 years ago, 8 years ago or whatever, that money will not be able to perform the same function in terms of its, purchasing power. And why is this important? Because it has a direct link with the next indicator that we are coming to talk about, which is the exchange rate, Winston.
Exchange rate, the cedi has been the Usain Bolt year 2024, running to the...
Not just 2024, I think it started somewhere around 2022, right?
Yeah, basically. And the central bank have decided that they had to be strong. We saw them maintaining the policy rate strongly. Every policy rate announcement, we're all looking out for something to be done, but it has been dominant. It has decided to maintain it until the last sitting, where we saw a review of 200 basis point downwards. Many have anticipated that going into next week, which is the last meeting of the committee, that's likely to maintain, looking at the key indicators signaled by the IMF indicating that we have performed quite well in 2024. That not being said will be a key issue, because businesses have always been saying that when they import prices, the exchange rate fluctuation has affected their costs, and that is also something that has become quite topical in the mouth of not just businesses, but individuals as well. They say they are not seeing value of their currency, because even though they save, within a few months, inflation will take away everything of their savings. However, the dollar seems to be the champion in this case.
Well, so another indicator that we'll be talking about, very, very important, is the employment or unemployment situation. Why is this important? Because we are going into an election where more than 10 million youth will be voting in this year's election. That's more than 45% of the total registered voters going into this year's election. That tells you that, look, I like to say that this will be our first TikTok election, because we'll be having the Gen Zs who will be voting this year, and it's really going to affect maybe so many of the old traditional traditional pillars that we've had in our economy. For the first time, we are actually going to have some new groups coming on board, and we know the fresh or what they call the new voters who will be going into this year's elections, more than 700,000. That number is huge. But talking about inflation, let's start from inflation, because this is a current inflation rate of 22.1% for the main inflation, the headline inflation. It just tells you that just by October 2024, if you compare that same price to October 2023, prices have actually risen by more than 22%. In terms of food inflation, it is higher than the headline inflation of 22.1%. And we've seen the World Bank estimate that, depict that there are currently about 10 million Ghanaians, or there will be 10 million Ghanaians by 2025 who will be actually living in poverty. They will be poor. Why? Because they will be earning below that, poverty threshold. That, I think, somewhere around, there's that figure that is there that, when you cross or when you fall below that figure, you're actually classified as being poor. And it's estimated that some 10 million Ghanaians will be caught in this bracket in 2025. Definitely, food inflation will be a key, determinant in this year's election. How are people buying food? How is it becoming expensive? Our favorite gobe that we used to enjoy, is it the same now? When you go to the market, the money you have is able to afford the things you want to buy. All of these things are what Ghanaians are going to look at. But I want us to look at this trend, because this trend of inflation from 2004 to 2023, Winston, tells an interesting story.
Before I touch on this, you mentioned gobe.
Yeah.
The moment Davy begins to complain about the price of oil, the price of Gary, and you yourself, you see Davy tearing or dishing the gobe for you, 2 ladle for 10 Ghana cedis, you should know the economy is in trouble. Now let's look at this. 2024 presidential election focus on inflation. We are focused on this inflation.
Yeah.
And the trend from 2004, we can see that in 2004, inflation was away around 15%. It rose to 16.5% in 2008. Within those 5 years interval, we saw inflation hyping up to 13.6% in 2014, but in 2016, it was hit at 17.5%. But one thing that was quite interesting is how inflation began to dwindle from 2016 to the tune of 2021, where it went marginally downwards until 2021, where we saw rising and flying without wings.
Yeah, what is interesting is that you can see peaks and troughs. You can see rise and falls in this curve that you are seeing on the screen. Now remember that we showed our audiences that there's an interesting story behind monetary policy rate and the way our presidential elections are actually, the outlook of our presidential election. The interesting thing is that what influences monetary policy rates is this curve, which is inflation. Now, what we realize when we're trying to understand the story behind these numbers is that, look, whenever you have peaks or whenever you have inflation rising during election years, key election years, especially after a government is done serving their 8-year term, what happens is that there's high likelihood that there's a change in government, holding all other factors constant. We are not saying that inflation is the only factor. But what we are realizing is that just look at 2007 to 2008. 2008 was when power shifted from the NDC to the NPP. Just look at it. You saw inflation started rising from a year before election.
Yes.
Peaked in 2000, somewhere around 2008, it was around 16.5, and then peaked after the election. What happened in 2008? We saw power shift from the hands of the NPP to the NDC. NDC takes over 2009. What happens is that they begin to get things right, and what happens is that inflation begins to go down again right from 2009.
A single digit.
Exactly, to a point I started recording single digits. And when just after we had election in 2012, and Mahama won that election, what happens is that inflation begins to see its head going up again from 2013, 2014, 2015, when we started having the energy sector crisis. What happens is that we saw another peak in 2016, 17.5% higher than the 16.5% that sent the NPP packet out of the Jubilee House.
Based on what we've done, the figures that has come out, it's to see if when it comes to a certain year, the key focus is just meeting the inflation target. We're forgetting that the effect of inflation is being felt by the citizens.
Yeah.
So
it's not just about the figures.
Not just about the figures. In 2008, the key issue then was water supply and electricity. In 2016 going, we saw power crisis.
Yeah.
One thing within those years was fuel prices. So we saw fuel prices keep moving up. Transportation fare keep moving up. So everyone will keep feeling the effect. You go to, you bought a car, the next day,
it goes to the same. Yeah.
So if those things come directly to the citizens, it becomes a deciding factor going into an election. The same thing is happening in this season where people are considering the price of foodstuff. In the U.S. election, don't forget, even egg was the decider in the election because to go to the market, they said the price of groceries.
Groceries, very important.
Taxes were all factors that led to many voters making their decision. So it's quite obvious that looking at the trend, inflation and the price differential, you go to a time where citizens became quite obvious. Although we need development, but don't take away the food.
Don't make our cost of living expensive. Now we saw 16 and 17 bringing a change in government. This is holding all other factors constant. Going into this year's election, just look at the figure beside you. 40.3%. That is the highest. In fact, in this whole period under review, we've never unprecedented figure 40.3%. This is the average for 2023. I mean, as of October 2024, we've seen that the figure has now reduced from the average of 40 to now the month of October recording 22.1. Still very high, but it's not as high as what we saw in 2023. But going into an election, this year's election, you're still having inflation, which is mimicking what happened in 2008 and 2016. We all don't know what will happen. But the story behind the numbers is that anytime we've seen such high peaks and such high figures, we all know what happens in the general election.
It would have looked different if we had worked on our key strategic policy, indigenous companies, bringing them to life, making sure that the key basket and deciders of our inflation, especially imported inflation, we are able to replace them with our own supply domestically. But we fail to do that. So
of course.
We keep having high imported inflation being one of the deciders against foreign inflation differential.
Now, another factor or another key indicator is what you see. Exchange rate, our biggest headache at the moment. Exchange rate. We've all seen how happy people have become.
Usain Bolt in the
Exactly. Usain Bolt is now decelerating at the moment, moving from the highs of 17 now to 15 cities, 80 pesos. But the story is that exchange rate is one of the key determinants because that affects importers.
Yeah.
And if importers are affected and they are paying high at the port, definitely that will reflect in the amount, the tariffs we pay, and then the goods finally finding itself in the local economy and how it influences our inflation. Now, another aspect of the economy that we need to really take a look going into this year's election is the domestic debt exchange program that we had. Now, I want to bring this to your notice that there were over 100,000 people who were actually individual bondholders who formed that forum. And their petition was that, look, government, save the 1.3 million individual bondholders. 1.3 million people. If you compare that to the current registered voters, that is very, very significant. In fact, 1.3 million is almost the same as the entire voter population of the northern region. That's higher than the entire voter population of the Volta region, higher than that of the Western North, higher than that of the Northeast region, higher than any of the Upper East and Upper West regions.
Just ordinary.
Exactly. These are middle-class people. So, and this is what the former Speaker of Parliament, former majority leader said about those that got affected by the bondholders.
And I quote, many of these bondholders also belong to the middle class, and that's where the major worry is. That is before the decision to enter, include them into the restructuring. If we are wiping away the middle class, that could be dangerous. So we need to have some further dialogue on this. So he was calling for
a dialogue because he knew what was involved. Why? Because in fact, if you should just take away that 1.3 million, beyond that, this is an MPP party that is known to be an elitist party. Most of the middle class we know in this country possibly align with the party, and they seem to follow the ideology of the party. Why? Because that's a property-owning party, different from that of the NDC.
Yeah.
So even if those who are affected are MPP people and they will not vote, definitely know that there's going to be that apathy that will affect the elections as well. This figure going into this year's election for me is important. Why? Because it talks about the youth, who are more than 45% of the total registered voters at the moment. And if you look at the country at the moment, 2 million Ghanaian youth or 2 million youth living in Ghana are not in education, not employed, neither are they in training. How huge is this number?
One thing that I commend the government for is the TVET education system. That is critical to ensuring skill training, to ensure hands-on experiences are professionalized. However, the key issue is whether there's market for them. You can train as many skilled people, where
very important.
The businesses go. We keep having this conversation about linkage between academia and industry. If industry, specifically the private sector, is empowered with the right environment, the right taxes, the right incentive, let businesses be businesses and let government be government. When we are able to differentiate and work collaboratively, trust me, these numbers will come down. It is a key decider going into election, knowing the number of youth we have, knowing the issue of idle youth. Just recently, I saw a video on TikTok of young, energetic, industrial young ones holding guns, playing in some of the cities in the country. And I was asking...
I saw that video, that trending video.
I asked him, these are bright minds, but they are idle. And idle people find work for themselves nonetheless.
Well, we've been looking at the unemployment situation for the youth, and this is what we have at the moment. If you see anything in green, that is NDC period. Anything in blue is MPP period. But going into this year's election, currently, youth unemployment rate, or youth who are what they call the NEET, not in education, employment, or neither in training, is about 18.2%. That means that if you select 10 youth in Ghana, almost two of them are actually not in any form of employment, education, or anything. And that figure is very, very huge. If you sample Ghanaian youth, going into this year's election, one key important issue to them, the important issue to them is actually employment. Who is going to create jobs for them? Maybe not government directly creating jobs, but creating the enabling environment for private sector to create jobs. We all know what has happened to the private sector after the DDEP, that banks have now diverted their capital to the private sector. Now they are giving almost everything to the government. Capital to the private sector has actually declined after the DDP was done. So, I mean, if there's anybody who wants to even create employment, the environment alone is somewhat not conducive.
The numbers here are not so good. One thing I suggest, possibly a proposal to the government, is that they should stop promising jobs. Promising jobs takes a lot of work. How many people can be entrepreneurs? I see government pushing for entrepreneurship. Nobody can be, not many people can be entrepreneurs. The US just creates the system and the structures. I see a huge investment going into entrepreneurs, while there are businesses that need expansion. There are people who have built business over the years that have the experience, the technicalities, they understand the losses that they've gone through, and they know where to put the money where their plans are.
Yeah.
However, if that were done, we could have been seeing some big numbers. That's why in most countries you see there are key billionaires, because the government understands their relevance in boosting the economy and bringing unemployment rate down.
Now, going into this year's election, I mean, it is important to talk about the youth who are not in employment, education, or training. Why? Because if you look at the big five, who are controlling this 2 million youths, the Greater Accra region has more than 500,000 of that. And the Greater Accra region is a key determinant in this year's election. If you have more than or close to 570,000 youths who are not in any form of employment, education, or training, that is a big headache going into this year's election. And whoever is going to win Greater Accra region should be a party that will possibly resonate with the youth in terms of their policies on job creation, good environment for businesses to live, and all of that. Now, the Ashanti region comes second, and this is the World Bank of the NPP going into this year's election. Yeah. It has more than 350,000 youths who are not employed, not in education, not in any form of training. Central region is a swing region. You cannot, all three swing regions are in this bracket. They are part of the big five. And you are going into this year's election, if you add this swing region and that swing region, if you add all these three swing regions, you've crossed more than, I think you've crossed a million youths who are between the ages of 18 and 35 years, very significant in this year's election, and all of them are not in employment or education. So, the manifestos of both political parties and the third forces must have solutions for these 2 million youths. And if you are looking at this, chart on the smart wall, be sure that all three swing regions are in this mix.
What these young ones, or vibrant, brilliant, intelligent youth are looking for is just one word: hope. And the hope will come with the strategy, it come with clear plans, clear futuristic plans that determines where they'll be in the next 5 years. However, we've seen a lot of our colleagues leave in the country. Over 200 youth every year.
Close to 300,000 people actually left in 2021.
And that data is reflective of where we are. We pray as a nation, we pray as citizens, we pray as policymakers who are watching us right now, that the decider of this year's election is certainly based on your current economic situation. We are hoping that as we advocate for peace going into this election, you also be conscious, just go to the ballot place, vote peacefully, and go home and wait for your result. However, we pray that violence will not be tolerated, and we eschew any form of election malpractices. My name is Winston Taki, and I did this with
Isaac Ofeja. We'll be back same time next week. This has been Beyond the Numbers.
Arise, O sons and daughters of Ghana land, black stars of hope and honor, Ghana, our beloved nation. We exercise our rights to choose our leaders. Make us cherish fearless honesty and help us to resist oppressors' rule with all our will and might forevermore. In a time of uncertainty, one voice can bring us together as one. Join me, Sonny Badu, and thousands of others for the Rhythms of Africa 2024 concert, promoting peace and unity ahead of the December polls